Hello, welcome to Paramusic TV. I'm Johnny Long with another edition of Classic Case Review. And this will be the second part of the Amityville Horror. Now, if you haven't seen the first part, I will give you a brief recap. And I'll also take this opportunity to ask if you would please like and subscribe if you enjoy what you see on this channel. And I will attach the first part of this edition onto this video. George and Kathy Lutz, Kathy's children from a previous marriage, Danny, Christopher, and Missy, in December of 1975, would move into the house on 112 Ocean Avenue. The address is significant because 13 months previously, Ronald DeFeo, also known as Butch, murdered his entire family. At this point, Ronald had just recently been convicted of the crime and was starting to serve his sentence. The family decided that they could live in a home where a murder had taken place. Shortly after moving in, the family began to notice something was going on. They would see shadow figures. The boathouse door behind the house would always be opened in spite of being closed and locked. And for the next 28 days, they would experience a variety of paranormal events. For the last 2 days that they were in the house became so extreme that they could not live with it any longer and left the house, leaving most of their possessions behind. A few months later, the story reported in a newspaper with a small interview with George and Kathy Lutz that once it became known to the public, especially after the release of the book, The Amityville Horror, written by Jay Anson in 1977. It was probably one of the most horrific stories anybody had ever read. However, since then, the authenticity of this case has been called into question, and that's what part 2 of this edition is all about. Now, when the book was released in 1977, it hit the world by storm, and it was, again, so over the top when it came to a lot of the things that were said to have been experienced by the Lutzes. But one thing that people don't realize and don't take into account, and this was the writing style at the time, the book was written as a novel around transcripts or tapes that the Lutzes gave to Anson, and he built the story around it. Now, George Lutz says in the end, most of what happened in the book is pretty accurate, but there were liberties and there were exaggerations. And if you look at early interviews with George Lutz when the movie was released based on the book, when asked questions about things such as the ooze that came from the walls, George was always quick to tell them that that was an exaggerated thing, but yet, yes, there was a substance that they would find on the walls here and there and coming out of keyholes. But as people started looking closer into the case after the book and the movie and started to dig, names were changed in the book, such as Father Picararo, the priest that blessed the home, a friend of George Lutz's. That in the book, his name was changed to Father Mancuso. And many people who researched the case and looked into church records with that name not in the records, a lot of people began to believe that this was fake, but he did exist and did bless the home. And it's kind of hard to tell what really happened, but I believe something did happen to him, and he was never really comfortable, didn't tell everything at first. In the book, of course, it was said that as he was blessing the home, that when he went to the room that is called now the sewing room, heard a voice that told him to get out, and at one point even claimed that he felt he was slapped. He didn't tell the Lutzes that he experienced this, but he told them to stay out of the sewing room, or that at least no one should be inhabiting that room. But the real genesis of the allegations of hoax really seems to come from their association with Ronald DeFeo's attorney, William Weber. The main reason the Lutzes called William Weber was, as they were learning what all had possibly happened to them, that maybe that whatever was in the house played more of a role in what Butch DeFeo did. And also at this time, Weber was working on an appeal for DeFeo, and they were likely going by the story that was told in court as part of Ronald DeFeo's insanity defense. The story that he had told was far more supernatural than the stories that he would end up telling towards the end of his life. With the insanity defense, you have to prove that during the commission of the crime, you couldn't distinguish right from wrong or reality from fantasy. So the story that was used during trial was, as Ronnie was downstairs watching TV, he overheard his family plotting to kill him. Now, he had done some drugs and had fallen asleep, but woke up to someone kicking him or rousing him out of his sleep. He said he thought it was his sister Dawn, but it was a shadowy figure, and in its hand it had the high-powered Marlin rifle, and began encouraging him to take it and kill the other members of his family. At the time, the Lutzes moved into the house and had their experiences. After hearing the story Ronnie told, which I think was reported in the papers at the time he was on trial, the story of a shadowy figure was very similar to some of the things they experienced in the home, and they contacted Weber, believing maybe he should at least know about all this, because they wonder if it didn't have something to do with what drove Ronnie to finally snap and kill all of his family. Then the Lutzes would meet with Weber, and with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, they began telling their story. But Weber was clearly seeing an opportunity and began to show the Lutzes that they could profit from this other than just the case itself. There could be books, a movie deal, and he even talked once about turning the house into a haunted attraction. Now, a short time later, Weber would send the Lutzes a contract with a proposed idea of starting a corporation which would include the first author slated to write the book, which was Paul Hoffman. However, the Lutzes didn't believe this contract was fair. They would also learn that he was planning on arranging it for DeFeo to receive 5% of the profits. And this is where the Lutzes closed the door. There is a misconception that this is an admitted hoax, which would mean both the Lutzes and Weber would have to say, yes, we concocted this story, it really didn't happen. This is probably because of the lawsuit that the Lutzes filed against Weber and Hoffman after it was found that Hoffman had sold the story to a magazine and the New York Sunday Times. The Lutzes would file a lawsuit claiming invasion of privacy, misuse of the trade name, and for mental anguish. Weber and Hoffman would file a countersuit claiming that the whole thing, of course, was a hoax and also breach of contract. Now, the Lutzes case was dropped because, for the most part, the Lutzes neglected during the time of these dealings to stipulate any restrictions on how the story was to be used.
However, he allowed the countersuit to continue. However, the judge pointed out the ethical questions of Weber becoming a literary agent on a case that he was involved in, and suggested maybe that this should be handled by the state bar, which of course means that Weber's job was at stake. And the next day, they settled out of court. Now, another blow to the possible authenticity of this case are other people who have since occupied the home. All of them claim that there was no paranormal activity during their time there. Things mentioned in the book, such as the front door being pulled off the hinges from the inside, a window that shattered during the last few nights that they were in the home. There was no physical damage to the house whatsoever. All the original doors and windows had never shown signs of having to be repaired. And the Lutzes also claim these were creations of Jay Anson based on some things that did happen. The front door would be heard slamming shut, although the door was locked, and when they came to investigate the sound, there was no sign that the door had actually been unlocked. After the movie was released and the address became known, people started to drive by the house in rather large crowds. I believe that the people that lived in the house claimed that there was nothing going on to make this stop, which is quite understandable. In my own personal opinion, I think the subsequent occupants of the house may or may not have experienced the sort of activity that the Lutzes did, but it's also believed by many the entity that caused so much activity followed the Lutzes, because they still reported experiences even after they moved out of the house, and even all the way to California, where they would end up moving permanently. That brings us to one portion of this case we haven't looked at yet, and only in recent times has become part of the story, Children. For years, we only heard the story from either George and Kathy Lutz, or maybe by reading the book or watching the movie. And at the time George passed away, he had begun to try to tell the story as he saw it. And by the time Danny began to speak out, both Kathy and George had passed away. Kathy in 2004 from emphysema, and George from a heart attack in 2006. Now, for the most part, Danny Lutz seems to agree with George and Kathy on a good deal of the things that happened. But Danny would later claim, along with his brother Christopher, who would start speaking a little bit later, that George might have been practicing more than just transcendental meditation. In the 70s, this had become quite popular amongst a lot of people. But Danny Lutz tells stories that indicate that he in fact was practicing some sort of black magic. They talk about having walked in on him apparently moving things with his mind, witnessed by other people that were also in the room as he was demonstrating it. And when Danny walked in, he was scolded and made to leave. But he also believes that George was trying to call something forth and was successful at this and paid the price. Even after they left the house and moved to California, they still experienced activity, although to a far lesser degree. But as even George said, it wasn't over. Danny and Christopher Lutz both have stated their disdain for George Lutz. Danny would run away from home at the age of 16, going back to New York, where he would stay until he was finally down for this documentary and decided it was time to go ahead and speak. Christopher Lutz would change his name to his biological father's name, Quarantino, and would join the army under that name, hoping that he would be anonymous since he was 7 years old and going to school was always known as the kid who saw the ghosts or the Amityville Horror kid. And this was something both Danny and Christopher tried for many years to escape. Now, the only one that we really have yet to hear from is Melissa Lutz. She was 5 years old during their 28 days at the house. Now, some attempts to contact her, I think, have been made, but she has basically said she doesn't want anything to do with the story and just really wants to be left alone, which is entirely understandable. Two of the hot spots in the house were both the sewing room and Melissa's room. It was in Melissa's room that George would see the shadowy figure moving about in her room as he had just finished closing the boathouse door again about 3 in the morning. And it was the one thing that made him realize what he was possibly dealing with. But the most memorable experience to come out of the book, and even more so the movie, was the quote-unquote imaginary friend, Jody, as some people call it, Jody the demonic pig. And she drew this picture, but also later, when the investigation was held with the Warrens, this picture was taken, and when later shown to Missy, she would claim that that was what Jody looked like when he appeared as a little boy. When it comes to it, I'm no longer wondering whether or not it was a hoax. I don't think it was a hoax. It may have been exaggerated through the book and the movies, but I think the basics of what happened to the Lutzes was, at that point in time, almost unheard of amount of activity. Another reason why people believe that the Lutzes may have faked this was because the Lutzes were having financial problems. Well, I do think there were some things going on with George's business, but their first mortgage check had not come in yet. And they say from the very beginning, when they left the house, they intended to go back. They wanted to try to fix it and be able to stay in the home. You have to remember, in these times, unlike today, where if a person is experiencing paranormal activity of any kind, that there's many places to call now. Back in 1975, there were only a handful of people that did such research that had any kind of real reputation. Now, to be honest, I was getting ready to wrap this up and was going to end it with part 2, but I've come to believe now I want to dedicate another part to the investigation that the Warrens conducted, because there are several things that did happen. But I think now the question is, what really happened in that home? Was it there before? I think possibly something was there before, because why did Butch DeFeo's father, in the year preceding the murders, place several religious statues and even a small grotto and some religious items in the house? And when he was asked why, his response was, "I have the devil on my back." Now, most people believe he's referring to his problems with Ronnie, which is possible. I can't say that wasn't it, but it seems more like he was trying to ward something off or make something go away.